I think it's been really important that we understand that we have been asking the wrong question. Not what's the matter with him, but what happened to him.
Tonight, $13 million is announced to fight addictions.
It's been decades of overrepresentation of First Nation children in care, and it's time we end this humanitarian crisis.
Plus, a new class action is launched for kids in care.
I had a really good instructor and I just never stopped.
And an Algonquin weightlifter competes for the first time. Hello, Tansei Anine. Good evening and welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. The Federal Minister of Health and Addictions has announced $13 million for harm reduction projects in the Prairies, the Northwest Territories, and the Yukon. Carolyn Bennett made the announcement in Winnipeg as the tragic overdose and toxic drug crisis takes a heavy toll across the country. APTN's Leanne Sanders has more.
Some people don't seem to be able to understand that the evidence is there. Harm reduction saves lives.
Health and Addictions Minister Carolyn Bennett says the federal government is committed to approaches backed by evidence, like harm reduction, and not ideology. Provinces like Saskatchewan have chosen not to fund safe consumption sites, and other provinces have placed restrictions on their operation. According to Bennett, 30,000 people have died of overdose in Canada since 2016, and she said the conversation surrounding addictions needs to change. Bennett says it's clear from the numbers that addictions and overdose have become not a they problem, but an us problem.
I think that when we think about trauma-informed care, we have to understand that some people fell off a roof and ended up with painkillers and then got cut off and had to go to the street for their drugs. Other people, it's the psychic pain of trauma, of residential schools, of child abuse, and that those people are numbing their pain with drugs and alcohol. When we think about people using drugs, I think it's been really important that we understand that we have been asking the wrong question. Not what's the matter with him, but what happened to him.
Projects getting funding include a walk-in clinic in Winnipeg where people can access addictions medicine, a harm reduction outreach in the Northwest Territories, and outpatient support for women in Saskatchewan. Leanne Sanders, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
10 First Nations throughout Manitoba and Alberta have filed a class action lawsuit against the Attorney General of Canada for harm suffered as a result of the First Nations child welfare system. The claim points to the quote-unquote devastating impact the system has had on First Nations due to the removal of children from their land and communities. The claim also says this prevented the passing down of teachings, which resulted in a collective loss of language, culture, and tradition. Damages are not specified. This is in addition to a $1 billion class action filed against the Manitoba government and the Attorney General of Canada in 2022. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found in 2016 that there were 3 times more First Nations children in the child welfare system than at the height of the residential school era.
You know, it's been decades of overrepresentation of First Nation children in care, and it's time we end this humanitarian crisis. This is one vehicle that, nothing else seemed to work so far. So, we're hopeful that the financial and political pressure of this action and the First Nations seeking justice for these communal harms will encourage Canada to come to the table, discuss much needed reform, and fix what is a very broken system.
Well, we want to hear what you think about this latest class action lawsuit. Here's how to continue the conversation. You can send your emails to news@aptn.ca, or you can leave us a comment on aptnnews.ca. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Follow APTN News to join the conversation and see our latest stories. The family of a man who died while under police custody in Prince George, BC, are disappointed the trial against officers involved in his death was delayed. They want systemic changes to policing in Canada. APTN's Lee Wilson has this report.
The family of Dale Culver and supporters gathered outside of Prince George Courthouse yesterday. They've been waiting for nearly 6 years for answers after Culver, a Wet'suwet'en and Gitxsan, 35-year-old father of 3, died during an arrest by RCMP officers in Prince George in 2017. The 5 officers who are facing charges concerning his death were to appear in court, but the case is now delayed more than 2 months. Lily Speed Namox, Dale Culver's daughter, stated even though the case is delayed, they are not going to stop seeking justice.
I had to show our support today and show that even though they might have moved the date, we're not going to stop, we're not going to move. This is still my dad's case. That was my dad's life that got taken away, and that means the world to us.
Virginia Pierre raised Dale Culver. She said after he died, it took 72 hours until they were notified by RCMP. Earlier in the week, the family held a press conference calling for systemic changes. She expressed frustration with the amount of time it's taken to find answers.
72 hours before we found out he's gone. Now we're waiting over 6 years. And then all of a sudden, nothing is happening tomorrow. There's something wrong here.
Last month, the Crown charged 2 RCMP officers with manslaughter in Dale Culver's death. 3 RCMP officers are facing obstruction of justice charges. The court date is now moved to May 2nd. Debbie Pierre was having doubts officers would face charges. Last month, she was relieved to find out the Crown was moving ahead with charges.
I honestly felt it was not going to proceed because this has happened across Canada for how many generations now with no justice. And it gives me hope, but it also with much uncertainty.
In an email statement to APTN News, BC RCMP also expressed concerns about the lengthy process and stated the officers remain on duty. The BC RCMP fully cooperated with the IOBC during the investigation and fully supports independent investigations and judicial reviews of police-involved incidents as required. We do have concerns regarding the nearly 6-year timeline in this instance, though, as it puts undue stress on the man's family and our members and their families, in the community, which has been looking for clarity and answers on what occurred. The members are operational, and their duty status is subject to continuous assessment. The Assembly of First Nations BC Regional Chief Terry Teegee called for changes along with the family. His family member Everett Patrick, a 42-year-old father from the Lake Babine Nation, died after suffering a serious injury in a Prince George detachment in 2020. Last year, the police watchdog asked the Crown to consider charges against 1 officer. Chief Teegee stated that inquiries need to be upheld in changes across Canada to address racism against Indigenous people.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the National Action Plan on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, the true and full implementation of Bill C-15, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, provincially C-41, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, need to be fully implemented to combat racism, to combat the view of Indigenous peoples.
Lily Speed Namox wants an apology from the officers involved in her father's tragic death. She stated it is unfair that the officers are on active duty. For the past 6 years, she's worked through her grief and has become a powerful advocate for changes in policing.
I refuse to let my dad's death be forgotten about without some kind of change, and to just be subjected to a number on a case file. And he was my dad and the dad of my 2 younger siblings, and that needs to be known, that he was a person. He wasn't an item or a piece of paper. He was a person just like you or I. He deserved to live.
The family remains determined to find answers to what happened to Dale Culver. Lee Wilson, APTN National News, Prince George.
It's that time to step aside a moment. We'll be back with more news shortly, including the first in a 3-part series on the Yukon's Pelly Banks, a First Nation that was disbanded more than 50 years ago.
We're the living epitome the living proof of the failings of the federal government.
Welcome back to APTN National News. Over 70 years ago, the federal government dismantled a Casca band in the Yukon. Now, its former members and descendants say they were wrongfully and illegally amalgamated with another band, and they want to be reinstated. Here's Sarah Connors with part 1 of that story.
For thousands of years, the Pelly Banks people use this trail as a trading route and food source. While the means of travel have long changed, their Casca ties to this area have never been forgotten. Commonly known as Pelly Banks, this area is the heart of the Pelly Banks people, a people whose history was erased by the federal government.
We're the living epitome, the living proof of the failings of the federal government.
Erica Gilson is the executive director of the Pelly Banks government. Her father-in-law, Harold Smith, is a member. The government is made up of a group of former Pelly Banks band members and their descendants. Its people claim they were wrongfully amalgamated with another band in the 1950s, and they want to be reinstated by the federal government.
Because we have a God-given right to be, just as you do or anybody else.
Pelly Banks, or Gastua, means salmon river in the Casca language. As the people were normally gone hunting and trapping, numbers are likely inaccurate, though documents provided to APTN show as many as 20 family groups living there at one time. In 1946, many of its people relocated to nearby Pelly Lakes to be closer to a trading post. In 1951, the Department of Indian Affairs created an official band list for Pelly Lakes, and in 1953, it was established as Pelly Lakes Band 11.
We're still on our land, walking our trails that were here thousands of years before any government ever came here and told us whether we have the right to exist or not.
Coming up on part 2.
And Pelly Banks is here, right in here.
We'll learn why Pelly Banks was dismantled and why its people say it was an injustice.
They did us wrong, so it's up to them to correct what they did to us, to our people.
A Canadian senator says the National Capital Region should put the brakes on plans to rename an Ottawa road. Donald Platt says John A. Macdonald may have played a role in the creation of the residential school system, but his legacy should not be erased. APTN's Fraser Needham has more.
Named after Canada's first Prime Minister, the road begins just past the War Museum and goes on for 9 kilometres. Donald Platt is the leader of the Conservative opposition in the Senate, and in an opinion piece in the Chamber's online magazine earlier this month, he wrote, "If the very father of the country can be cancelled in this manner, what will be left with respect to Canada's founding as a nation, its settlement of immigrants across the country, and its constitutional history that remains worth celebrating?" Back in January, the National Capital Commission decided to explore changing the name of the parkway because Macdonald authorized the creation of the residential school system. So Platt wrote, "The effort to blame the entirety of the shameful history of residential schools on Macdonald is, at its root, an ideologically driven campaign that seeks to vilify not only Macdonald, but Canada itself." Quebec Senator Michelle Odette is Innu, and she says she respects Platt's opinion, but the move to rename the parkway is reflective of a more complete understanding of Canada's history and Macdonald's role in it.
By renaming, I think it's a good action, or by telling the truth. There's not only one truth in Canada. There is the truth of my colleague and friend, this senator, and I hope he understands that there's also our truth. So for me, it's a good gesture when an organization or a politician or a movement is saying, we don't want that name anymore. And here why.
Odette says she believes Platt's opinion is a minority one, and most Canadians are in favor of changes like renaming an Ottawa street.
I will be angry if the majority deny that it happened. I would be angry, and I'm allowed to be angry, if the majority says, no, we're not going to change because it was like that. We cannot change the past. For me, yes, there's places that we can change the past.
When asked for comment, the National Capital Commission provided an emailed statement that says, the naming project is attempting to provide a more fulsome history of the area, as well as reflect the significance of the river, landscape, and shoreline to Indigenous peoples and the community. Senator Platt's office declined comment, saying the article speaks for itself. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
All right, we have to take one more short break here on the program. Our photo of the day and weather are next. Plus, a young Algonquin powerlifter is practicing his A game.
I've been strength training for 2 winters.
Welcome back. It's time now for our photo of the day. As the weather slowly gets warmer, the wood ducks are returning. APTN National News viewer Greg Scriver shared this great shot near Ottawa, Ontario. Thanks so much for that one, Greg. That's a great one there. If you want to be featured as our photo of the day, you can email your shots to share@aptn.ca, or you can tag APTN News on Instagram. All right, now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. We start in the east, 1 degree in St. John's and 1 in Charlottetown. -9 in Coujavac and +1 in Happy Valley, Goose Bay. 3 degrees in Quebec City and 3 in Montreal. +7 in Toronto and 10 degrees in Windsor. -1 and some snow in Wawa and +1 in Thunder Bay. -18 in Churchill and snow and -11 in Norway House. -10 in Barons River and -8 in Winnipeg. -7 in Regina and -8 in snow in Saskatoon. -11 in snow in Buffalo Narrows and -11 in Stony Rapids. As we make our way west, -6 in snow in Fort Chippewa and clear, and -3 in Peace River. 3 in Edmonton and 1 in Calgary. 9 degrees in Vancouver and 9 in Campbell River. 7 degrees in Sandspit and 6 in Fort Nelson. 2 degrees in snow in Whitehorse and -20 in Rock River. -15 in Norman Wells and -1 in Fort Liard. -21 in Colville Lake and -25 in Inuvik. -25 in Cambridge Bay and clear, and -22 in Whale Cove. -31 in Resolute and -13 in Iqaluit. Well, this week on In Focus, we took the show out of the newsroom and into the International Indigenous Tourism Conference. We spoke with Indigenous tourism operators from across the country about how they share their traditions and cultures from their regions.
You know, COVID hit us all, and Indigenous tourism was the hardest of the hard hit. The good news is it's rebounding really fast. The demand and the operations are getting back up to steam really fast.
Kind of take this sort of British colonial high tea and totally turn it around and make it an Indigenous product, and an Indigenous tea offering where it's, you know, outside instead of inside, where it's herbal instead of, you know, English breakfast.
So we try to do all things Métis. So we do different programs like our wildlife park. We bring people through and we talk about the relevance and the importance of bison.
Way up in Churchill on the edge of the Arctic, the furthest you can go in Manitoba is, you know, we have a business called Wapuska Ventures, which is we have 50 sled dogs.
This site has been a gathering place for every nation located on the Northern Plains, all coming to this central location for hunting and for trade and for ceremony as well.
People are naive and they take stereotypes. So sharing that, exposing it worldwide potentially I think is huge.
An Algonquin powerlifter in the capital region is hoping to be on his A game. He's about to enter his first competition this spring, something that's 10 years in the making. Here's Annette Francis with that story.
Zach Liberty gives a brief description of his training technique.
You got to take really, really long rests in between sets. Sometimes you got to rest for like 3-4 minutes because you got to make sure you're as good as you were for that first set when you come back at it. There's no use in kind of working fast with this kind of stuff. You got to recover and take your time.
He's been pumping iron for the past decade, having caught the bug for it when he was in college, and it's stuck ever since.
It just got to be like a natural thing that I really, really got into. So I took a course to kind of get my feet wet about it. I had a really, really good instructor, and I just never stopped.
The 28-year-old Algonquin from Pikwakanagan, Ontario, is now gearing up for his first provincial competition. Liberty says it takes a lot of time and preparation.
I've been strength training for 2 winters, so it's kind of like a 5 to 6 month block, and then off and then back on. So I've been going since October this year.
Liberty is joined today with his friend Aiden Lee. They met at this gym 2 years ago. They belong to 2 different powerlifting federations, but support each other's goals.
It kind of just helps us motivate each other. I know sometimes we come in, we have completely different weights, completely different sets, but the exercises that remain the same between our programs, we'll try to hit together. We'll just kind of swap out the weights between set to set. And a lot of this stuff is like neurological, like it really fires you up if you have your mind there.
Liberty proudly details the weight he can hoist.
So I've deadlifted 405, squats 335, and bench 275. So trying to beat those, yeah. And some of them look like I can beat them right now, so I'm fingers crossed that I have it together.
He's training specifically for a Canadian powerlifting competition in Hamilton next month.
I'll be heading there at the end of April and hope to bring my A game for sure.
Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
One of the performances at this year's Juno Awards last weekend in Edmonton focused on intergenerational trauma caused by the residential school system.
It was over 300 kids that went to school, and I used to cry. I was lonesome. I was wondering why I was sent here, and I didn't know why. What did I do wrong?
Does it feel like we're on the edge, staring down at certain death?
It was a moving performance which featured a hologram of his grandfather's image, a jingle dress dancer, and the award-winning drum group Northern Cree. He told reporters after the show that he made this album as a way to remember his grandfather and his stories. Asanabi hails from the Sandy Lake First Nation in Northern Ontario. He said his biggest fear was that the song would traumatize residential school survivors, but he heard from at least 2 survivors recently that said they found it healing. Well, it certainly is a beautiful and moving song. All right, that's all we have for you tonight on APTN National News. If you missed any of our stories and you want to catch up, aptnnews.ca has you covered. I'm Daryl Stranger. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great night.